Hello, everyone. We do have some teas and coffees at the back of the room if anyone wants one before we start at 2 p.m. Thank you.
Andy, good to see you. Good to see you.
Welcome everyone to the second Trustworthy Data Governance Frontiers meeting. It's so fantastic to see so many of you here in person, and particularly many of the familiar faces who've been collaborating with the Pan-UK steering group over the past few years. This is the second Frontiers meeting we've held on the theme of trustworthy governance. Our inaugural meeting was in 2022, just over 2 years ago, when many of you attended, and we all pledged to work together to activate a step change in trustworthy governance to support an acceleration of data-driven research. So we're coming together now to celebrate the progress we've made in the past few years, working in partnership with all the organisations here, and also to consider some of the challenges and priorities for the year ahead. Andrew challenged me today to make governance exciting. And we're delighted that Ian Diamond, who chaired our inaugural meeting, is here today. And I think the fact he's attending a second Governance Frontiers meeting is clear evidence that governance is fun. But also the fact that the Wellcome Trust have preemptively invoiced us for the costs of their bar security and cleaning staff staying late this evening, having recognised the runaway success of the drinks event at the first Governance Frontiers meeting is also evidence that governance is definitely fun. So fantastic to see you all here today. I'm going to hand over shortly to Surian, who's going to give some opening comments, but just a very quick note on housekeeping. Just to highlight, we're not expecting a fire drill, so in the event of a fire alarm, please do make your way down the stairs to Gordon Square. And we've got lots of the HDR UK team here today, so if you need any assistance, please do speak to a member of the team. And on that note, I'll hand over to Surian. Thank you.
Cathie, thank you. I can't think of anything more fun, actually. But it is absolutely just brilliant to be here. And I think we should thank Cathie for organising it on a day just 2 days after the Prime Minister made such an important speech, and how you knew that was going to happen, Cathie. I mean, I will be asking you for tips for the 6:30 at Taunton later, you know. But I do think that it's a really exciting moment in time. Andy and I were just talking about how we've been on a journey and Andy, it's been such a thrill to be on a journey with you. I also, talk of journeys, sometimes we all think, of course, it's pretty awful. I go back to 1982, when I did some work with an absolutely path-breakingly wonderful, sadly no longer with us, obstetrician called Tony Letchworth in Winchester. And Tony had decided that administrative data would enable him to understand much more about the clinical practice he was using. And so he took me down to the basement of Winchester Hospital, introduced me to a very nice lady, the name of whom I cannot remember, and said, "This is my friend Ian." She'd never met me. Just give him access to any records he wants to look at. There was the ethics, there was the privacy, there was, and I did. I just sat for a few days looking at records. And if you think about that now, you think, oh my God, and I just think sometimes, firstly, how far we have moved. The second thing I would say how far we have moved is that the only way I could think of to use these data was to sit in the basement of Winchester Hospital and look at a record and write it all down, and then go back to the mainframe computer at the University of Southampton and type it into the cards and eventually do a bit of analysis. What we can now do technologically is, I think, unbelievable. Not just technologically to use data, but technology to keep those data safe. And I think it is really now a moment in time that we are able to access data in a really safe way, but equally to be able to use them, to be able to do analyses which has the potential to transform the lives of our fellow citizens, to reduce inequalities and to improve outcomes in many ways. And I feel unbelievably thrilled that this afternoon we've got Robert, who I just think is brilliant in this, and also Cathie. And if you've got 10, 15 minutes at some stage of your lives and you haven't seen Cathie's talk at the launch of the Sudlow review, then please, please, please go and do it. I've recommended it, Cathie, to so many people, and people have come back to me and said, I had a look, gosh, that is rather good, isn't it? And it makes the case for linking health data and setting up a national health data service, and I think that's what we should all be committed to. Because however we go, it seems to me there's almost no world in which one data set is going to answer all the questions that we need to answer. I don't see it happening. There are data sets, unbelievable cohort data sets, unbelievable things like Biobank, which are just wonderful and which can transform some of the work that we do, But at the same time, they will almost never answer every question. I had coffee the other day with Mike Marmot, and seeing yet again the wonderful frameworks that he has about what drives health and well-being is just path-breakingly inspirational. But at the same time, bringing those frameworks together requires data from multiple sources. And I do think that we talked about this. I can remember talking about this around the turn of the century and people saying, Ian, that's fine, but you're mad. I remember Andy reminded me of the 2011 meeting we had when we were talking about how it was now maybe possible to do some of these things. But we are now in a position where I think linkage is possible, where ethics are better understood, where output, if you like, safety is also understood, and where, frankly, we have the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle, and that's statistical methods, to be able to analyze these data and to do so in a reasonable length of time. Fundamentally, half of what we're doing is analyzing hierarchical chain graphs. When Juan Lucia and I worked out how to do that in 1994, it took us 6 months to analyse one small chain graph. 6 months. There was a woman who was in 10DS in Downing Street, 10 Data Science, who showed me how to do this in 5 minutes on a mobile phone. I was just path-breaking. So that's the technology, but let us not remember that throwing technology at things without understanding the statistics and the methods is a route, in my view, to false conclusions, and that's worse than where you go in the first place. So number one, we can do safety. Number two, we've got brilliant people in this country, but we need to make sure that we are bringing them together in the right way. Number three, we need to make sure that we've got the ethics and and a really clear enunciation of, is this in the public interest? And that involves talking to the public. Number four, we need the convening of somewhere like HDR UK. I just think we should really just praise to the highest hill the work that HDR UK is doing in this world. I think it's absolutely brilliant. I was going to quote from my letter to UKRI saying that it should be refunded, but there was so many hyperbole in it that you wouldn't have believed I could really write that stuff, but I meant every word of it. So thanks very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I'm so looking forward to this. It's an important moment for all of us, because at the end of the day, if we get this right, we can improve the lives of all our fellow citizens, and that's not hyperbole, it's just fact. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, Ian. So I'm going to briefly summarise some of the work that we've been doing since our first Frontiers meeting, and cast everyone's minds back to 2022, not quite as far as 1982, which I know was 42 years, a year I was born. So it's taken a bit of time to progress from the having paper records in the basement model, but still not quite where we want to be on governance. This slide was shared in our inaugural Frontiers meeting, a paper published back in 2022 about the experiences of some researchers trying to access linked data. I've added since to the slide this rather wonderful process diagram from the paper, which I think really frames the problem. So in this case, it took 2.5 years to access data. The authors report completing 47 applications of 384 pages with 162 separate submissions to access these 7 data sets. The conclusion of the paper was, the current system is incredibly complex, arduous and slow, stifling innovation, delaying scientific progress, streamlining the number of applications required for accessing data for health services research, and providing clarity to data controllers could facilitate improvements in healthcare. So we thought about this a few years ago as we were framing the challenge and also the opportunity of working together on streamlined governance models. So we set about a challenge and we decided to break it down into pieces and have some focus areas after our first Frontiers meeting. And we convened a series of working groups which we termed action forces, intentionally because we wanted them to be very output driven and very much focused on practical tools to help the community. So we convened action forces around specific areas of focus. And in 2023, we had a huge push on transparency. And then moving from there, we looked very much at the legal pieces, legal tools, contracting templates. We've also been working on putting data access processes in a more transparent way in a mapping. And we'll also come on to talk about some of the work that we've been doing around trustworthy governance frameworks. So this just summarises where we've been since the last Frontiers meeting. And I just wanted to pick up on a few of the specific areas of focus and the progress that we've been making. So starting with the transparency standards work, led by Yemi and also with our Public Advisory Board. This piece of work was actually initiated by the HDR UK Public Advisory Board, who had done some research into the transparency of data access processes, trying to find out how to access data and how data was being used from looking at publicly available information. And they wrote a report which concluded that a lot more transparency was needed. It was very hard to follow the processes and understand how data was used. So working in partnership with the public, the transparency standards were created. And following that, we were very fortunate with support from the MRC and our other funders to be able to fund 19 projects to implement the transparency standards. On the slides is just some of the outputs of those 19 projects. Those shown are DataMind, UK LLC, HQIP, Grampian Safe Haven and ICNARC, but there were other, many other fantastic outputs. So the purpose of this funding call was to fund an area that isn't often supported with additional funding, making the data access process more transparent, more understandable and more accessible. And back in May, many of you attended the Transparency Showcase where we heard from some of those funded projects and saw some of their fantastic outputs. And then another set of fantastic work led by Rachel to develop legal tools specifically focused on data access in trusted research environments. So this group has been coming together to look at mapping roles and responsibilities and creating different templates to standardise parts of the processes across TREs. And particularly working in partnership with the NHS Data for R&D programme on the contracting pieces, which has been fantastic, and also with brilliant support from the HRA and the Four Nations contracting leads. So we've looked at mapping the roles and responsibilities of the different parties and creating guidance around those different roles. That was one of the key asks from the First Frontiers meeting to help to sanitise some of these obligations and how they flow through to the parties. There's also been a huge piece of work around streamlining contracting, again in partnership with our Public Advisory Board. As far as I'm aware, this is the first time there's been a public co-creation of a contracting template related to data access. And it's been brilliant to have that partnership. So the group started with benchmarking data access agreements currently out there, drawing those into principles, working with members of the public about the protections they want to see and how they should be communicated, and then building a template. And we had partnership with ABPI, other members of the steering group, particularly the NHS and the HRA, and now we're moving towards implementation and adoption phase, and we'll be announcing some funding shortly as well, taking a similar approach to the transparency standards to support organisations looking to update their contracting models. And then third is the mapping project, and I think we can partly thank Ian for this actually, because he said it would be low-hanging fruit to put the processes for accessing data on a page at the First Frontiers meeting. And Adele from our team was given this task, and it turned out to be significantly more complex than we were anticipating. Less sort of low-hanging fruit and more unpicking the spaghetti junction. But Adele has done great work with lots of partners in the room to put data access processes on a page, taking inspiration from the London Tube map to visualise the different steps across the Four Nations and showing ethics and governance approvals and the different stages from the researcher side and from the TRE side. And on the other side of the slide, you can see a zoom in. So there's a companion tool. You can click on the individual lines in the tube map and take you through to the steps and the different guidance from the data custodians. So this really complements some of the work that the MRC Regulatory Support Centre has already done in making data access processes more transparent. And again, this has been developed with really close collaboration with our Public Advisory Board. We've also been focused on disseminating some of the work of the group. Many of you in the room have co-authored various papers with us, and this is something we're also going to be moving forward with in the coming year. Rachel and Andy are going to be talking about some work that we've been doing on trustworthy governance frameworks and how we disseminate that and work together on it. I was trying to round up all the things that have been going on in the steering group with our members over the past year, and there's just a huge amount of developments in governance in the wider landscape with the publication of the Sudlow review as well. So it feels like a great time with loads of momentum around governance. And as Ian said, we did time it fantastically well, obviously with a foresight of what the Prime Minister would announce this week, but brilliant to see that the AI speech did include a mention of health data and the importance of it being available in the National Data Library. So going forward, there are a lot of developments happening across the landscape that we're expecting over the next year. Potential legal reform, ICO consultations, potentially future guidance. And it's really important that the steering group plays a role in ensuring that all of these developments reflect the realities of data science and research, and we can provide that voice for the research community. The action forces over the last few years are coming to a close in terms of their scope, so we'll also be reconvening the steering group at our next meeting in a couple of months' time to take input on priorities and where we should be focusing our efforts going forward. So it'd be great to see lots of you at that meeting, and any suggestions that you have for areas of focus and priority over the next 12 months, we'd love to hear those either at that meeting or before. So thank you very much everyone for being here, and I'm going to hand over to Sir Robert. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Cathie. Good afternoon, everybody. It's a huge pleasure to be here and to reflect on one of the most important challenges for the newish UK government, and indeed for most governments around the world, which is including in health, but beyond as well. How best can we unlock the potential of the myriad data that public bodies collect from citizens, from businesses and other entities, by sharing, linking and analysing them, and then using the insights we derive not only to improve our understanding of society, of the economy and the health of the nation, but to design and implement effective policies. I'm also personally delighted with the fact that I may already have contributed to knowledge. Having been born in Winchester General Hospital, it may well be that that was part of was one of the punch cards that Ian managed to insert somewhere. And whether anybody's learnt anything useful from that, I don't know. But it's nice to know there may have been a contribution back in those days. I think it's also important to remember in the private sector, data and personal information are, of course, assets that underpin the market valuation of some of the world's biggest companies. And it's reflective then that governments too need to understand and exploit these intangible assets on their own de facto balance sheets, albeit primarily for their social rather than their financial value. This challenge goes to the heart of the UK Statistics Authority's strategic goals, Statistics for the Public Good. I have the honour of chairing the UK Statistics Authority Board. For those of you who are unfamiliar with it, the authority provides independent oversight of the UK statistical system as a whole, promoting and safeguarding the production and proper use of official statistics. We have two executive arms, the Office for National Statistics, the National Statistics Institute, biggest producer of official statistics in the UK, and the Office for Statistics Regulation, which comes up with, promotes and polices the Code of Practice for Statistics. The authority also oversees and supports the Government Statistical Service, the community of statisticians working in other government departments and public bodies. Tackling virtually all the important policy challenges that we face as a nation in an informed way requires multivariate analysis using social, economic and health data from a range of sources. So sharing and linking different data from different places is both necessary and desirable. Governments say often that they recognise this need, and we have also had the benefit of great advances in data handling technology to help bring it about. So what is the problem? Unfortunately, there are various ethical, cultural, societal and economic factors that complicate the task of getting to what might seem a straightforwardly desirable outcome. I'll come on to a number of these and how they can be addressed and how some are being addressed by the authority in a minute. But before I do, let me just reflect briefly on how data can be used to address questions of temporal causality that are so important to building understanding and policy design. In November last year, we learnt of the passing of the great medical statistician John Fox. During the 1960s and 1970s, John was amongst those investigating the counterintuitive healthy worker effect, whereby, for example, mortality was higher among coal industry employees working above ground than below. In the early 1980s, he led work exploring the association between unemployment and mortality. It was leaked before publication, and the Morning Star published a misleading headline to the effect that unemployment was a death sentence. The then Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was not best pleased and asked for his resignation. As John Fox knew well, both examples show that you have to be careful when inferring causality from a simple association between two variables. You might work above ground rather than below ground, or be unemployed rather than working because you're in poorer health to begin with. We know that when you bring more information into play, you get a richer and more reliable understanding. In this spirit, when John Fox left the civil service to go to City University, he put his skills into setting up what is now the ONS longitudinal study. This links census and life events data for a 1% sample of the population of England and Wales born on one of 4 undisclosed birth dates. The study has been running for about 50 years and, with the support of the ESRC, has helped us learn much about the demography and health of the nation. The current government seems to have recognised the danger of inferring causality too simply in policy design by embarking on a vision by which it hopes to tackle 5 key public policy challenges, in part through cross-departmental missions rather than in traditional Whitehall silos. The leaders of the health mission explicitly recognise that there are many social and economic determinants of poor health, while those leading the opportunity, safer streets and growth missions recognise the importance of health, among other factors, in determining outcomes in these domains. Having recognised these interdependencies, we need good data to support the missions, linked, analysed and communicated imaginatively and responsibly, and made accessible to users both inside and outside government. Large and not so large cohort studies have been a valuable part of the UK research and policy analysis landscape for many decades. The UKRI website lists almost 50 of them. Some, such as the 1946 National Survey of Health and Development, were originally envisaged as short-term projects. But through the support of many funders, innovative data collection, and ever more exciting analysis, we've been able to tell what Helen Pearson described in her 2016 book as the extraordinary story of our ordinary lives, providing incredible data increasingly over the full life course. These are global jewels in the UK data crown, but are too often less well known and exploited than they should be. Advances in technology mean that these cohort studies and more recent ones, such as Born in Bradford, for example, can now be augmented and enhanced in many ways. As Ian mentioned, many biological markers are now available and used widely, for example, in the UK Biobank study. The pace of change has been very rapid. It was only around 15 years ago that John Hobcraft looked at the potential for augmenting social data with biological markers in the ESRC longitudinal study, Understanding Society, and it's barely 10 years since Alan Langland's landmark report, the Administrative Data Task Force, on the potential of administrative data in many areas of research and operations. Alongside survey data, administrative data are critical for many reasons and have been embraced across the research spectrum. That is, where they can be accessed and used effectively. Some of the attractions of doing so are, first, that administrative data are sometimes more inclusive than surveys, which matters if we're interested in capturing all parts of the social economic spectrum, as we should be. For example, the ONS is looking at using linked data to investigate the impact that fuel costs have on child poverty, and thus whether policy linked to reducing those costs could be a relatively effective way to tackle this problem. Second, social phenomena rarely take place in neat departmental silos. The path-breaking work on rough sleeping, led by Stephen Aldridge at MHCLG, exploited administrative data spanning health, criminal justice, housing, and employment. The widely praised longitudinal education outcome study, LEO, links data on young people's school and tertiary education performance to their subsequent incomes. Third, it is generally easier and more reliable to use administrative data to set up pseudo-cohorts in almost real time that allow us to answer questions about temporal causality without waiting for a cohort to age. They also enable us to address carefully the identification problem of age period and cohort. In the survey context, if you ask people about their lives, they often either forget or in sensitive areas selectively report. And if you're interested in something rare, then surveys often don't have enough data to answer the research question reliably. Fourth, administrative data provide information on outcomes that surveys can have difficulty detecting. Take migration. The ONS can now generate actual migration numbers by linking administrative data rather than relying on a survey of intentions. This allows it to identify the characteristics of migrants with much greater accuracy. Linking administrative data has also enabled ONS to answer questions about the economic outcomes experienced by people who come to our country as refugees much more authoritatively. Looking ahead, the government recently commissioned Baroness Louise Casey to chair an independent commission into adult social care, which is widely regarded as unfair, complex, confusing, and failing to meet growing care needs in the population. Data linkage and sharing will be essential to understand the complexities and deficiencies of the current system as they enable holistic analysis of healthcare, social, and financial data across different sectors. So much for the benefits of sharing, linking, and analysing administrative data. Why does this not happen more routinely? And how might the improved data governance proposed by UKSA in collaboration with others such as HDR UK potentially improve things? I'll highlight a few themes here, but I would also commend to you the statement put out by the Office for Statistics Regulation last week on how government can make more data available for research in 2025. Sharing and linkage are distinct concepts. You can have either without the other, but what are some of the barriers to one or both? First, there is natural conservatism on the part of data owners and controllers. The risks of data sharing and linkage often look larger than the perceived benefits, with the former feeling very close to home and the latter assumed to accrue externally to other departments and policymakers. As a result of this mismatch, and despite positive statements from ministers and others, there can be a lot of inertia compounded by the practical challenges around the process. Potential data breaches are often understandably at the forefront of data owners' minds. People are right to be concerned about privacy and security, of course. The risk can never be eliminated entirely, but these days it is perfectly possible to set up secure environments that satisfy any reasonable requirements with the help, for example, of the National Cybersecurity Centre. Indeed, many trusted research environments are these days arguably more secure than the environments where the data came from. Under the auspices of the Digital Economy Act, the UKSA has established a research accreditation panel to oversee the independent accreditation of processing environments, researchers, and research projects. And in 2025, it will be looking at how we can streamline this process. Technology helps. The use of APIs means that in time there will be no need for large data lakes, and as Ben Goldacre's 2021 review for the DHSC concluded, a small number of interconnected environments could provide a secure and efficient solution. Privacy-enhancing technologies can also help so that organizations can analyze and extract valuable insights from data while protecting individual privacy and maintaining compliance with regulatory requirements. Relevant approaches include data masking, differential privacy, and secure multi-party computation. Of course, some data scientists simply say, I don't want to use a platform, I just want the data. But it isn't simple as that, and unsafe sharing is worse than no sharing at all. A second barrier is that data linking is not straightforward unless you have a clear indexing strategy that's being widely used. The ONS-led Integrated Data Service, or IDS, is a cloud-based platform that has unified the approach to data linkage by indexing each data set once to whole population indexes of people, businesses, and addresses. This allows direct linkage between any two data sets to be completed on demand and with ease. Systematic indexing is essential for federated data linkage that breaks down departmental silos. The technology that underpins this index once, link many times approach is known as the Reference Data Management Framework. It's fully operational, and its indexing first principle has been endorsed by all major government departments. This is not a trivial undertaking. The data engineering is significant, and the IDS program has thus far focused on linkages that address important policy questions. For example, one of the aims of the growth mission is to have more people participating fully in the labour force. Health interventions can be powerful here, and the linking of health and labour market data through the IDS has already enabled valuable work on the impact of bariatric surgery and talking therapies, for example, both of which are shown to be positive for labour market outcomes. Alongside the IDS, as Cassie's already mentioned, the government is developing its own vision for a national data library, and it will no doubt draw on lessons from the IDS's experience about both the opportunities and the challenges involved. The IDS team has been engaging fully with this exciting development and has been advising on some of the lessons learned in the analysis. We look forward to seeing how this develops and how best the authority and the IDS can contribute and collaborate. A third barrier to sharing and linkage is the time and effort required to secure long-term agreements between data providers that are rooted, as they should be, in robust, transparent, standardized, and accessible processes for granting data access. Application and approval processes vary considerably across different custodians and can be very slow to navigate. This needs to change, and the Pan-UK Data Governance Group is making important progress. The IDS has already signed agreements with ONS, HMRC, and DWP to allow data from these departments to be added to the IDS continually. And embracing the principles of Cathie Sudlow's report, NHS England has reached a groundbreaking agreement with the IDS to make linked health data available to government analysts for the first time. The Office for Statistics Regulation has suggested that one way to speed the approvals process would be to re-examine part of the 5 SAFEs framework that underpins administrative data access. Specifically, it suggests that we might move away from accrediting SAFE projects to accrediting SAFE programs. This would allow approval of broader areas of research using specific health and wealth data sets without the painstaking need to renew applications when researchers simply want to use different variables within those data sets. This could bring many benefits, but it will be important to consider what is practical and legal under the current legislative framework, as well as ethical. Fourth, anyone who thinks data from administrative sources are clean and beautiful from the get-go has probably never used them. In a fiscally constrained environment, the costs of data engineering and wrangling are not insignificant, and they aren't one-off when you require regular flows of data. For data sharing to work in an effective and durable way, funding has to be available, and it has to be a priority for data owners to share their data. This is a further advantage of the index once, link many times approach. Costs need to be shared, as they have been in the sharing of the UK cohort studies by the ESRC Data Service, for example. Many PhD students have learnt a lot about data quality from cleaning these data, with the subsequent resharing improving the opportunities for greater knowledge. Data receivers should expect to invest in data cleaning, and this expectation should be reflected by funders. The Treasury is going to need to recognise this with respect to the administrative data that the government requires to support its missions. Fifth, let me turn briefly to the UKSA strategy strapline, Statistics for the Public Good. This has 2 important implications for analysis, whether for operational research purposes. First, that it should be ethical, and second, transparent. The former is addressed in part by requiring all work undertaken using the IDS to have been approved by an established ethical committee or by the National Statisticians' Independent Data Ethics Committee. The latter is addressed by requiring clear and open communication of the project and of its results. Protocol should always be available, and publication times should be published in advance. This approach to research outputs is consistent with the OSR's principles of intelligent transparency, which have proved a very effective way of bringing good practice to life to the benefits of statistical producers and users alike. The OSR points out that it is not just high standards of analysis and publication that are important. Statistics have a life beyond their initial publication by official bodies and are used in many ways by a range of actors. So they should be produced, used, and communicated in an open, clear, and accessible way. These principles will be central to the updated Code of Practice for Statistics, which is currently being worked and consulted on. Sixth, it's important to ensure that analysts using sensitive data are competent to do so in a safe and ethical way, while not requiring every user to do things in exactly the same fashion. Within government, the IDS requires departmental directors of analysis to sign off a piece of work, but for outside analysts, some accreditation is prudent and desirable. This doesn't apply only in obvious cases like the use of sensitive individual health data, like mine at Winchester Hospital, but also, for example, the use of anonymised data on large businesses in small geographical areas, where in practice that use is going to identify the firm. It's reasonable to expect users to abide by an established set of rules, and an excellent set has been produced by the UK Data Services James Scott. It includes clear folder and file naming conventions, supplying the underlying numbers in cells, providing clear, accurate explanations, making sure all tables, graphs, and figures have meaningful names and are numbered appropriately, and checking rigorously that all this is done. Not rocket science, just good analytical practice. Seventh, and perhaps most important, we must always recognize that exploitation of administrative data has to take place with at least the implicit support of the public who originally provide it. Unlike many purpose-designed cohort studies, respondents are typically never asked for and do not give explicit permission for the multiple uses to which their administrative data to which they contribute can be put. Recognizing this, it's essential that public bodies regularly test and retest the public's appetite for the use of their data, understand concerns, and ensure that their perceptions of risk have some grounding in the perceptions of the public. The OSR sees strong evidence of public support for secure data use when this serves the public good, but this can't be taken for granted. Public support isn't unanimous and tends to be context dependent. Thoughtful, transparent, and comprehensive public engagement is therefore vital, and this is one reason why the UKSA is an enthusiastic participant in the Public Engagement in Data Research initiative led by HDR. There have been significant missteps in the use of health data in the past, and we cannot afford another one if we're to exploit the massive opportunities that currently exist. Public confidence is perhaps best maintained by emphasising the practical use cases for the data to which citizens contribute, and not simply an abstract claim that the state can be trusted to think of ways to make good use of what it knows about us. Government should also ensure that all citizens can easily access published data and analysis, reducing the opportunity for misinterpretation or misunderstanding. These barriers and challenges are significant but manageable. But is there actually a demand for access to these data that justifies the necessary effort? But very simply, yes. Looking alone, the list of projects currently underway on the IDS is impressive, and over the next 2 years, it will hopefully migrate over 2,000 analysts from the ONS Secure Research Service, giving them access to hundreds of data sets linked through the innovative indexing strategies I mentioned a moment ago. And the same is true of other platforms such as OpenSafely or those in the devolved administrations. Partly because of the challenges I've described above, it has taken longer for the IDS to build up the critical mass of data sets and users that was originally hoped and envisaged, but it is not unique amongst complex transformational data projects in that, especially when they require technological, regulatory, and cultural advances all at once. To conclude, I know that this audience needs no convincing of the opportunities that sharing and linking data from administrative and other sources presents to improve people's lives. By way of summary, let me finish with the 6 enablers of change set out by the OSR in its statement last week. First, leadership is needed to ensure that data sharing and linkage is prioritised and consistently resourced. This needs to start at the centre of government but carry through into departments. Second, collaboration is needed to drive and maintain a cultural shift. We need agreed processes within government to work through disagreements about sharing data, as well as working with those beyond government. Third, transparency about what is being done with data, why, how, and the impact of data use is crucial, not only to enable public trust, but also to build awareness of why and how data can be used effectively. Fourth, practical solutions are needed to facilitate data sharing, access, and linkage, including the wider use of shared standards and access platforms like trusted research environments and the proposed data library. Fifth, safe use of data must be ensured to maintain security and privacy, drawing on but hopefully improving the flexibility of frameworks like the 5 safes with investment in privacy-enhancing technologies. And finally, data literacy needs to be improved across government and the civil service to further the effective use of data and analysis. Making sustained progress across all these dimensions will not be an easy task, but the prize is achievable and well worth pursuing. Thank you very much. Give the difficult ones to me.
Yes. Brilliant. Good sidestep. Thank you so much. And I think those 6 enablers of change almost map on exactly to the enablers of good governance. So fantastic point to end. We've got time for a few questions and some roving mics coming round.
It was a terrific talk, and we must get it published, which would be a good thing. So on the number 10 website this week, the headline was PM sets out blueprint to turbocharge AI, which I think is great. But there are huge dependencies here in terms of sorting the data, which is the feedstock of AI, plus the governance. How cited do you think are policymakers on the importance of doing the heavy lifting well and in a scalable way? Because it doesn't hit the headlines, but that basic infrastructure is so important. And what can we do as a community to feed into government? Unless we get those basics right, we will not turbocharge AI.
Yes, I think the question of how rooted and how well understood that is, I think this is relatively early days. I'm not sure that all of that will be thought through. Certainly some of the questions, more broadly around AI, of where, for example, in the regulatory landscape that ends up, I'm not at all clear, and it's not also an issue where you can think about that purely in the UK context on its own. So I think there's already I know Ed Humferson, for example, in the close to our home at the Office for Statistics Regulation, would be wanting to think about where the scope there, and because there could be as you say, a rather crowded area where nobody's quite sure who's responsible for what. The danger is if everybody's responsible, nobody is singly responsible. Ian may have a better sense of whether that has all, I've not been close to those conversations, all been mapped out very carefully. I strongly suspect that would be premature to argue that is the case.
I think it would be premature, but a lot of people know
that it needs to be done.
And there is a lot of conversation, which I think is a real opportunity for certainly UK to input. A lot of conversation is what legislation would potentially be needed.
And I think there are issues as well, obviously, around the use of AI within government as a tool, etc., but also in terms of the work that the OSR does in terms of ensuring that data is used and communicated appropriately, that concerns about misleadingness or misrepresentation are tackled. The danger of a black box scenario where more outputs emerge into public debate and consciousness, and it's one of those, that's what the model says, that's what it's come out with. We know all the debates about to what extent can you be confident, can you communicate the robustness of what is going in and the robustness of the processes that pull stuff out. It feels reminiscent to me as a former, economic forecaster, which for a very foolish career choice I did for 10 years, the debates about, well, you can just rely on a statistical package model here, you put it in, well, that's what the computer says. If you're trying to explain to the country why you're taking a set of economic policy decisions, that's not enough. And so I think across some of those dimensions as well, thinking about how we can robustly communicate and give the public confidence in the outputs that emerge from the use of AI is also going to be important, as well as actually setting out an institutional framework within which all that can operate.
I have more than a question, an observation. As a public contributor, I am also a PPI member for several platforms. I need to say that I think it's very important. First of all, I liked your speech. It was very comprehensive and very good. I need to say that I feel the need of collaboration, but there is these platforms in England, in Scotland, they're all spread out, and they all there is no common, as you say, the collaboration between them, and there is no common legislation or regulation or policy. I think it's very important for researchers and for scientists and policymakers to collaborate, and so that this platform collaborate, and also not just nationally but also internationally. Researchers now, there is a researchers to go abroad for research and collaborate between different universities all over the world. So, and there are a platform, like an example is Data Shield, that is now is an international platform that can provide data to different countries as well, and collaborate with the national to offer international data, administrative or health data to each country. And also, there is a big problem. I work for the NHS, and I'm a patient, and I looked at my care notes as well, and my health notes. And I need to say there is a need of accuracy for the notes. Health professionals don't listen to the patients, and interpret write the health records on their own interpretation of what the conditions of the patient is going through, and so it's a bit of, sometimes there is a misunderstanding and no accuracy, and lots of problems on the data themselves. And I think that's important. If the data are not accurate, the AI can be what is fed with data and real data. And yeah, so I wanted to point out this.
Yeah, well, you've raised lots of interest points. Let me just pick up on one: the collaboration and the consistency of frameworks across the devolved administrations. Clearly, an important issue. One that, when, for example, you're thinking about what you might be able to do in the future for, population estimates, etc. Conscious, in addition to chairing the authority, I also chair a public finance watchdog in Northern Ireland, and there the sort of the legal position, what they can do on health data, on some other sorts of data, is not the same. And obviously, being in a position where you know what those differences are, where they're biting, and what are the key inconsistencies that you might be able to unlock is quite important. I mean, Ian and colleagues across the devolved administrations, chief statisticians in the other nations meet very regularly, and I know that those are some of the sort of issues that you need to deal with. On the other hand, we have a devolved framework, and part of the point of devolution is that the devolved administrations may have different policy objectives, they have different frameworks, and they're also asking for different sorts of data to address the way they want to run their services, be it health or otherwise. So to some degree, there's a bit of potential inconsistency built into that. If there were no inconsistency, then you'd be asking yourself, how meaningful is the devolution? But the way forward is through communication and collaboration and trying to identify, where there are things that you can move towards that get everybody into a better position. And as ever, and I say this with it doesn't show through in the accent, with the Northern Ireland hat on, the assumption that just that's the way England does it, so everybody else can buckle down and do it the same way, is not necessarily the way to get to a collaborative solution there.
Thank you. We've got time for just one more question. I think, Michael, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Cassie. I won't stand up because then I'll be back to people. But Michael Chapman, I work at NHS England. I'm also a member of the Research Accreditation Panel, so I spend a lot of time thinking about how are we linking up health and non-health data, and really good to hear those examples. I don't think we're quite as far forward with IDS, unfortunately, as the briefing may have said, but we're still working on that one. The question, though, links to that, and we treat health differently. I bet if you talk to HMRC, if you talk to DWP, they will all say their data is special and sensitive. So I'd be really interested in your reflections on, should we be trying to align health to the wider framework, or do we accept that health is different and we work out ways to work within those constraints?
The technical bit of that question I may come to into. I think one thing which is striking, again, returning to the sort of international issue, is the sensitivities about different sorts, the relative sensitivities placed around different sorts of data will differ from place to place, from country to country. For example, how excited, not excited is the wrong word, how sensitive people are to the use of their financial data versus their health data, differs across geography, and I think you can't rely on it also remaining the same over time. So clearly, if you look at Scandinavian countries, the notion of, in some cases, having your tax return publicly available is showing a different set of appetites across this. I think an important issue here is to not assume, is that once you think you've got a sort of handle on that as to where the sensitivities lie, don't just assume that's job done. Go back, retest how public sentiment and sensitivity to the use of particular sorts of data is changing, where people's anxieties are arising, how the public's, and I think this is an area where how the public's attitude to the use of data in the official system is affected by how they see it being used by the big commercial platforms as well. This is fast-moving landscape, as we know, and you could see some unintended consequence of some event in the private sector space, for example, if that is reflecting through on, giving more information on people's financial positions, how that could shift that quite quickly. So I think saying you have an answer to that question and stick with it and job done, hard in its own case, but be wary that this could be fluid and the nature of the sensitivities can change. Ian, is there anything you want to add on?
No, I mean, it's great working with Michael, and it's a real challenge. But I do think if we are serious about federated data, then we need to be serious about data standards and data interoperability. Thus far, that's really, really hard. We've been finding that the way to do this is, frankly, doing it ourselves for people, because that gets it done. But there is increasingly, I mean, you mentioned HMRC and DWP. We're working very well and very closely with both those departments at the moment.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Brilliant. I'm now going to hand over to Andy and Rachel.
Thank you very much, Cassie, and thank you, Sir Robert. Okay, so we're delighted to talk to you this afternoon about GUARDS, which are a set of governance principles which we're going to introduce you today, which are designed to promote trustworthy public benefit research. And at the last Data Governance Frontiers meeting, we were all galvanized by a shared mission, an overarching objective to facilitate system-wide governance frameworks, to the sort of things Ian was just talking about. If we're going to bring different data sets together, different systems together, we need a system-wide governance approach with standardization and alignment. And this not only will open up new research opportunities, but also open up our ability to communicate effectively with the public and drive and accelerate trustworthy data use. However, within that, we identified a gap. While there's a tremendous amount of innovation going on, lots and lots of good practice and initiatives which are pushing forward that story, we identified that there is no unified principles-driven framework, which is a governance framework across all that we're doing. And if we were going to develop this, it would help practitioners inform their decision making about how they design systems and approaches, policies and practice. It would help us all pull in the same direction as we're driving innovation. But as I say, this key bit is about how we can communicate and develop trustworthiness with the public. So we set ourselves a challenge at the last Frontiers meeting to do something about this, to address this gap. So I'm delighted to be here today to talk about the guards and introduce them. I just want to comment, this is a team effort. Andrew always talks about team data science. An awful lot of organisations, specialists, and the public have contributed to the development of the guards. I hope there is a strong agreement in this room that if we're going to have acceptable public benefit research using the public's data, we're going to need to balance scientific utility with technical and ethico-legal requirements and the wider social issues that impact on trustworthiness and social license. And governance carries a lot of the burden in striking this balance. And in fact, if you're going to sum up governance in one word, maybe it is balance is the objective it's trying to achieve. But there's a live risk if the controls we implement to help safeguard the public's data, to protect their confidentiality, those controls might impact on our ability to share data efficiently and in a responsive way, and limit the public benefits from research because some of those controls may impact on the data, either accessibility or the utility of it for the research function, or can introduce biases and other challenges which might reinforce research inequalities, or as Sir Ian pointed out, lead to spurious research findings which are worse than having no findings. Now, governance frameworks help us balance the complex and potentially conflicting issues and factors which inform our risk assessments about how we make our decisions, set our policies, operate our trusted research environments and other settings. And one of the best known of these frameworks is the 5 safes. So I'm briefly going to touch on that first, because the 5 safes has done wonderful things, both in terms of pushing the community together in an aligned way, gaining international traction, but also as a tool to communicate safeguards to the public. And it's worth reminding ourselves at this point that the 5 safes is a decision-making and risk management tool, which largely focuses on balancing data utility with safeguards to protect confidentiality. It's not a standard, it's not a set of prescriptive rules. And I'm going to borrow Ed Humpherson's graphic equalizer analogy here. So you can see the 5 safes operating in 2 distinct contexts. On the left, we're placing a data set in the public domain. For example, to spur industry innovation and to drive new products based on public data. And because once the data's in the public domain, we have very little control over who's using it, for what purpose, and with what methodology, all the controls we have at our disposal rely on making sure the data are safe, to make it anonymous, for example. But typically, that means reducing the granularity and richness of the data, which therefore impacts on its research potential. So over the last 5 to 10 years, or possibly even a bit longer, we've been developing this notion of trusted research environments, which are known by other words, but basically secure settings in which data use can happen. And here, we have control over the people, the projects, the settings, and the outputs. So we can put much more emphasis on the controls in those domains and be more risk tolerant about the data themselves, retaining that utility, which is incredibly important for research. Now, however, while the 5 safes does a fantastic job in helping us make those decisions, it does not include all the dimensions which we need to consider and accommodate to properly balance scientific utility with ethico-legal considerations and the extended social factors we know are crucial to establishing the social license with the public. And we've learned, as set out in this paper, that if we don't get social license right, if we don't get trust right, then important data-centric initiatives can fail. For example, 5 safes is silent on public involvement, which I think we would all put our hands up and say we're committed to. It doesn't talk about the need for equity, both in terms of equity of access to data, but also equity in terms of the outputs and benefits data can bring. And you could say that actually both of those things are part of safe projects or safe settings. However, that's not explicit or clear, and it doesn't help practitioners work towards a common goal to try and unpick what certain terms might mean, and it doesn't help us communicate that those things are important to us when we're talking to the public, because we know those things are important to the public. So as we're now working towards system-wide alignment of data governance, we need a holistic framework for governance, which encompasses all the relevant factors and from which we can distill action-orientated commitments and embed those commitments and practices into our infrastructures and the design of our policies, practices, and accreditation criteria. And we're not alone in identifying this. Following on from the pandemic, lessons have been learned, important lessons. This one in the technical report for UK Chief Medical Officers states that in any health emergency, data from hospitals, primary care, health protection agencies, and academic research, and I think they've missed out all the socioeconomic and environmental domains of that, but you get the point, needs to be shared rapidly between a range of organisations in order to get the research findings and action-oriented policy findings we need. But this requires data governance processes which support interoperable data platforms. Also learning from the pandemic, the chief scientific advisors of the group of 7 nations identified a key priority was to adopt a principle-based governance system for securing safe data sharing and the use of data in responsive emergency contexts. But such a principle-based governance system with holistic coverage doesn't exist. So we've established the guards. So we've spent the last 2 years since the last Frontier meeting consulting professionals and the public on what that would look like. So we're really proud here and pleased to launch the principle guards as a principle-based governance framework. And the principles are that research using public data must be guided, understandable, aligned, responsible, it must deliver, and we need professionalisation and stewardship of the data. Now, Rachel's going to talk through in the next part of this presentation what all those mean. But what we want to emphasise is this strong focus on ensuring clarity, transparency, and meaningful public involvement in governance processes. Also, the equitable use of data in terms of equity of access and outcome. And the role of data stewardship in terms of professionalising governance and the rest of our community activities. Now, you will note that those guards acronyms and those points don't focus on issues such as anonymisation strategies or technical frameworks and controls, as these are already perfectly well established within the 5 SAFEs principles. Rather, what we're looking at here is the guards principles acting in synergy with established principles like 5 SAFEs and more wide mechanisms. And we believe the guards should be conceptualised and promoted and used in combination with 5 SAFEs. And we suggest the safeguards as the way of getting this message across. And for that reason, it's lovely to have all the original developers going back way into the ONS days who came up with the 5 SAFEs concepts, like Paul, like Richard, like Felix, as part of this team. It's really important to us that it isn't that the guards are replacing 5 SAFEs, it's the 2 frameworks coming together to have that holistic coverage. The component parts of safeguards are not new, and we're not inventing a new standard. And neither, to use Sir Robert's terms, this isn't rocket science. But actually, if you take understandable as a principle I think we could all commit to, the HDR UK Public Advisory Group found understandability of trusted research environments, data access procedures, who was using data for what purpose, to be lacking in an audit. And the transparency standards have pushed us in the right direction, as is the work of understanding patient data, the National Data Guardian, and all the work PEDRI is starting to push forward on understandability and co-development with the public. So it's not that understandable is rocket science, it's getting it right, having the target and the aspirations to work to, which is what we're aiming for here. In terms of scope, safeguards are interdisciplinary and cross-cutting. They're not just about health data, they're not just about trusted research environments, they're about all research using data about people. And we've heard today already that this is very topical. This moment is right because we've got the new mission-based approaches, which are for government, which are going to need data to be brought together across different silos and from different domains. We've got infrastructure investments like integrated data service, like the secure data environments emerging, and of course the National Data Library. So as we design and launch these new capabilities, we're hoping that the safeguards provide a principles-based framework to inform our decision-making and give us a target as to what best practice and good aspirations look like. So on that note, over to Rachel.
Thank you, Andy, and good afternoon, everybody. Nice to see you all here. So now that we've explored the need for this governance framework and these principles, and we've worked extensively to develop these with members across the 4 nations, today is our opportunity to unite and to turn these words into actions. There's been lots of important work in this space, and we acknowledge and recognise that there's plentiful amount of standards and resources available, and we want to use safeguards as a tool to point to these resources, and also to highlight any gaps that we need to fill. All the principles have associated commitments. There are, I believe, in total 25 of these. These are not going to be mandated compulsory commitments. These are demonstrations of best practice in each area, and they're aspirational. They're what everybody should be aspiring to achieve within the safeguards framework. So this is where data governance really does get exciting. We want your input now that we have you here. So we have this QR code. If you have a phone, please do scan it now. If you need any assistance with this during the break, please come and find us. If you don't have a phone, we can help you out there. So this takes you to a Menti board, and we'd like to get your input on these questions in order to utilise safeguards to accelerate trustworthy data use. So the questions are, what would facilitate the adoption of these standards in your organisation or the wider data research ecosystem? What are the barriers to organisations adopting the principles and commitments? And how can we ensure we actively involve and work in partnership with the public in data governance matters? So you can enter 3 answers per question, and you have up to 25 characters each. They're not full sentences, they're keywords. In our discussion session after the break, we'll be bringing this up as a word cloud, and we can highlight the key points that have come out of this to inform the discussion going forward, which will be a Q&A session. So the development of the Guards principles took the format of a wide stakeholder consultation with the Pan-UK Data Governance Steering Group, and you can see the logos of the organisations involved represented here. We then had 2 focused in-depth workshops to really define, so the principles started out as very detailed, and we wanted to define what should ultimately be included in the principles, so the content. We all discussed and decided that the scope should be beyond TREs and SDEs, and the Guards principles should be applicable to the whole data science ecosystem. And we discussed impact, and we've come together as the steering group to co-author a paper which we'll be submitting to the Lancet and hope to be published in there. And we discussed implementation and adoption and the fact that we might need to be developing training and tools in order for the principles and commitments to be adopted, and also that monitoring and audit might be required in order to demonstrate continuous improvement. In parallel, we had a public consultation on the go in the form of a survey that's been co-developed by 2 of our Public Advisory Board members, Melissa and Sarah Jane McAteer. So thank you very much to both of those. The survey gave an overview of the Guards principles and then asked for agreement with each principle, asked for clarity of language and any changes or additions that we needed to make, and whether the commitments accurately reflected the principles. So this survey was sent out to our wider public involvement network, the HDR UK Voices Network, where we aimed for and achieved 50 responses to get a diverse input to our principles. These have now been written up in a report, which will be published on Zenodo and supplementary to our main Lancet paper we hope, and we'll be referencing that. So it gives a detailed overview of all the input and how it's fed into the resulting principles. So the GARD's principles themselves, so Andy's run through what each one stands for, but it's important to note that each one starts with the leading sentence: research using data about people must be guided by and respectful of a diverse range of public perspectives, be understandable and transparent to all stakeholders, so that's researchers as well as the public and data custodians, have aligned governance processes and accreditation standards, be responsible to ensure that research access and benefits are fairly distributed across society, deliver public benefit and effectively balance safeguarding public rights with enabling research, and have effective stewardship from trained and supported professionals. So we've got printed copies available around the room for you to look at these in more depth, but I'll just give an overview of what the commitments represent. So guided is largely around decision-making processes and policies involving the public and encouraging a diverse public voice and meaningful involvement. Understandable is all about transparency and clarity of language around data governance operations, processes, and data use, and the importance of providing accessible formats of information. Aligned highlights the need for standardised and streamlined accreditation processes for both SDEs and for researchers. Also, the importance of standardised data access application forms and contract templates, which is close to my heart. As you know now, I've been working on the DAA for a while, and the need for these to be in place in order to accelerate data access and use. It also makes reference to the 5 SAFEs framework and the FAIR guiding principles as key overarching frameworks to point to. Research must be responsible in the way that it's both for the public and researchers. So we need to have fairness and equity in the way that data is accessed and used. And by these groups, we need to empower communities in order for this to happen. Research must deliver. So in terms of public benefit, there's been work on this to date. National Data Guardian, for example, has produced a report on this, but we need to be clear across the board. What does public benefit mean? How do we measure this? How do we approve and reject applications based on this and make this in itself publicly available and share across the network? And also, we need to have a system that is responsive to emerging challenges. I don't need to highlight the pandemic to anybody in this room, but we need to be prepared for anything future that comes about to be able to respond with all the data that's needed to perform analyses. So stewardship was a point that was really important that came out of our public feedback. So having a defined career path and role for a data steward, which is independent of those accessing or managing the data, is key. There needs to be work in this area, and this needs to be formalised. So this slide just highlights some of the work that's already taken place that we would be able to point to with the safeguards framework. This is not at all comprehensive. It's just to point out that there's been some excellent work so far and there's excellent work ongoing. But as mentioned before, it can act as a way to highlight any gaps and how we need to fill these. We recognise and have no reason to see why safeguards couldn't be applicable to an international audience, and we've already started discussions with groups in Canada, Australia, the US, the Netherlands, people working in the European health data space. And this quote here is just a demonstration of the keenness to work collaboratively. So this is Professor Tan from Singapore following our establishment of our partnership with HDR UK. I'm now delighted to introduce Sonia Patton, who's one of our Public Advisory Board members, who's going to really help us understand the importance of the public voice in this work. Thank you, Sonia.
Apologies there, Rachel. That was sick daughter at home ringing, so I thought I had it turned off. Good afternoon, everybody. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Sonia Patton. My professional background was as a procurement manager, but in the last 10 years, I am a patient, living with and beyond cancer. Like Dave, one of our UK voices, my life was saved by data being used to benefit health research. In fact, 10 years on, the treatment I would have got for breast cancer that I would be getting now has eliminated the need for chemotherapy. So quite a lot of research has gone into it, but that is so important going forward because of the side effects of it. So that's where we're moving in. From Northern Ireland, if you haven't guessed, I'm acutely aware of the challenges of sharing health data, as mentioned by Robert Chote. The way forward is communication, absolutely. So why am I here? I sought out the Public Advisory Board because I wanted to ensure that Northern Ireland was represented in sharing health data. So I was lucky to join the Public Advisory Board, and we are 12 passionate individuals. I would say that because we're quite honest and open to critique, and we are here to inform and provide constructive challenge to the strategy of HDR UK. We encourage and enable trustworthy science, and we advance it across the Institute. And we help ensure that PPI is integrated throughout HDR programs across the Institute. Now, one thing I want to say before I move on is I'm a patient representative on many national research organisations, and I have to say that this is real. This is real. It's very much about co-production. You heard co-sharing, co-design. But the thing about being on the PAB is you get to influence, and it's very real. So moving on. Why is the public voice so important? And I think for this, I thought I could easily have, just put it into Google and had a search, and I thought, no, that would be an injustice. So in preparing for it, I felt it was important not to be generic, and so reviewing the remit of the PAB, the public consultation that both Cathie and Rachel have alluded to, and Professor Cathie Sudlow's review, uniting the UK health data. There were many words that came up in all of those documents, and so doing a word cloud and then backing it up by ChatGPT just to make sure that it was right. There were these were the 5 key words that come out, and you'll see it all around you, but empowerment, we're enabling communities to influence decisions, equity, and equity, not equality, but equity, ensuring fair representation and benefits across all of society. Accountability demands transparency and responsibility. Trustworthiness builds confidence in ethical, secure, and meaningful data. And transformation. By unlocking that, the benefit to revolutionate lives and outcomes is immeasurable. And so for me, this experience, this resonates with all of this. I'm interested and I'm invested. And as everyone has said, this is an opportune moment to take this forward. So why is it so important to get it right? Trust across communities. It ensures everyone, regardless of background, feels that their data is treated fairly and securely. It also looks at diverse needs. And what I mean by this, it reflects on the different perspectives across communities, ensuring data meet the unique needs of all groups. Equity, I've heard it mentioned so many times here today, and I am delighted about it because it's not equality, it's equity. It's making sure everyone has the opportunity to inform and to find out about health data research. It prevents biases and ensures that every community benefits equally. cultural sensitivity. I think that's one big thing that we do. We talk about diverse populations, but it's more now about cultural sensitivities involving diverse voices, respecting traditions and values and lived experiences. And the last one is shared impact. And what I mean by that, it connects communities to the tangible benefits of their contributions, fostering inclusion and empowerment. And I think it's important to say that this is not without a challenge. It's not easy, and many research organizations have tried and failed. But you have to keep chipping away at this. You can't just do it once and say, well, it didn't work. And I work as a patient representative in the clinical side of it. And too often, it's hard to include. Researchers said, oh, it's very hard to do that. We didn't have the time. But, you know, it might be hard to do, but if someone says, people are easy to ignore as well. So it does mean you have to keep chipping away. The eyes of the public are on you. You said you would, so show me how. So what that means is, what does that mean when it comes to a patient or a public who wants to get involved? The GUARDS principles, and what I did is I looked to align this. So taking the first one, guided, actively listening to diverse voices to ensure everyone's concerns are heard and respected. And I know working with the PAB, they're very much about emphasizing inclusivity and decision-making and meaningful involvement. The next one is understandable, breaking down complex processes into clear, accessible language that everyone can relate to. And the latest research from Cancer Research UK say that the average reading age of the public is 9 years of age. Now that's taken across that whole diverse population. I spoke to researchers before and they say, oh, it's 13. No, it's 9. Aligned, so simplifying systems to create fairness and consistency so no community feels left out. I think it's really important because this is getting down to the granular detail of working within communities. Responsible, prioritizing ethical use of data to protect privacy and ensure everyone benefits equally. Deliver, focusing on improving lives by addressing real-world issues that matter to communities. Ask the questions, what is it we need to do? And then again, stewardship, training professionals, putting them in place who truly care about public trust and will act to protect it. So boots on the ground, feet on the ground, people working within communities to establish. And we've got the PAB, we also have HDR voices as well, but we also need organisations to be behind us to drive that forward. So lastly, Cathie and Rachel alluded to there, and Andy mentioned it, there has been a lot of work already done by HDR Voices. 2 of the Public Advisory Board members were involved in a consultation and worked with HDR Voices to actually, look at guards. What does that mean for them? What are the benefits? What are the challenges? And so what I've done here, I've taken some quotations with regards to the first, they've guided. The public must be involved to ensure data collection and use is endorsed, understood, and trusted by them. Understandable. It's essential that the information is easy to understand and not jargon. It might seem easy for you, for researchers, but for the public, we need to take it down to a level that they can understand. Aligned. You always get the highest quality results when people from a broad, diverse background are involved. Deliver. The principles ensure that research benefits the public and focuses on outcomes that matter to all communities. And lastly, stewardship. Data stewardship requires professionalism and trustworthiness to handle the public's data responsibly. So in concluding, having been a PAB member for the last 2 to 3 years, I've seen a tremendous change in what's happening across the data landscape. I'm confident the change is afoot. So my message is we really need to push forward. And again, words that were used, we need to collaborate, communicate across all communities and across the 4 nations. And it is a challenge. We need to be able to build trust and transparency. I looked at this as well, in the public, with the public, in the safeguarding of their health data, and you know, so that they know that their data is safe. And the reason for that is it's better health data research. It's for the benefit of all. So thank you. Thank you very much for listening, and I'll glad to let you know that we now have a break for coffee. Yep. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonia, for bringing the voice of the public to the Guards and for all the contributions. Yes, so hold your questions and thoughts. We're going to come back to a Q&A after the break. 15 minutes, so that is 10:02. We'll return. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes. Does that work then? So it's 1 hour. What time will we due to finish? 5.
So we've just, after us is Cathie and
Yeah.
So
Okay, that's fine. So if we do 15 minutes. No. Okay, right, let's do that then.
We want the word cloud up now.
No, we'll give everyone one last go on the Menti QR code and then do it. Hello, everyone. If we can retake our seats, please. We have the microphones. Hi everyone, sorry to interrupt the coffee break, but we've got a drinks reception afterwards so we can get back to the chat and the networking then. We're going to start with the results of the initial Menti poll and then do the second and third question before opening up to question and answers on the safeguards. So the link to the Menti is still up there, so if anyone wants to scan the QR code before we move on to our first word cloud, please do. And if we can, move to the, brilliant. So our first question was, what would facilitate the adoption of these standards in your organisation and the wider data research ecosystem? Thank you for the 109 responses. We're going to have to sift through them, but I suppose what comes up there's no giant word, apart from possibly the inevitable funding, coming out as prominent. Yes, no surprises there. But I think the ones around it of simplicity, incentives and awareness, there's a diversity of things here which are going to need to be put in place. And one of the things we've been contemplating as HDR UK and the Pan UK Data Governance Group is some sort of knowledge hub which produces materials based on wider best practice and points in the direction of all the excellent work which is happening all over the community. And that hopefully simplifies what the landscape looks like, raises awareness for sure, but also supports some of the challenges we will have with finance. And we should be building on each other's work rather than reinventing the wheel. So can we now, we've now got the second question. So if you tap to the next one, I think I understand how Menti works. Brilliant. So this one is going to be in real time. So what are the barriers to organizations adopting the principles and commitments? So put in your 3 key words or short sentences and see what things you think might be stopping us as a community adopting the safeguards and working towards those aspirations and examples of best practice that Rachel was talking about. Okay, right, so this is great. The early words, there is more of a, it's moving too quickly, it's making me feel seasick. So I'm gonna look away. Give you all another minute. Brilliant. So it's not changing so quickly now. Leadership, understanding again, clarity, I think is in there somewhere. I think I've seen some things about capacity and other priorities and how we prioritize these. Silo mentality is an interesting one, isn't it? I don't know who put that, but it's, yes, how we start working collectively across sectors, across nations, across communities, to think about what the commonalities are and how we push forward. Thank you, fascinating. Okay, before we go to the general Q&A, we've got one more question. So how can we ensure we actively involve and work in partnership with the public in data governance matters? What is the key to unlock that? There's already lots of good things happening. We heard from Sonia, and they've got lots of people from the HDR Voices and PAG here today. So it's happening in elsewhere as well. But what other things can we do? Live it. I like that one. Yes. No, it's true. If we're going to bring the public with us and involve them, it has to be real.
Inclusion from the start is an important one there as well. Daily Mail headline.
Yes, I was trying to pick the weeds out of that one.
Is that a carrot or a stick?
But I think, it's triggered thoughts when I was going back to that social license paper which we had up earlier, and thinking back to the headlines in the Daily Mail when care.data was launched and the issues there, and much more widely. It's what we need to do is ensure a diverse voice into our thinking, decision-making, deliberations. And that's one of the beauties of public involvement is I get to step outside of my bubble and to hear what others are thinking.
Somebody has put up there about pay for the time, but that is so important when we talk about equity in any decisions that we make. It is important to recognise that it's important to recognise that members of the public have to take time out of there to be involved, and where there is any substantive pieces of work, then they need to be considered as an honoraria or payment for their time.
Yeah.
Because that's where you ensure equity.
Thank you, Sonia. Yes, an important point. And thank you for whoever posted that. Thank you for those. I'm sure that will keep us busy to unpick what those means and to challenge us on our next steps as we go forward. So I'm now going to open it up for general Q&A on the safeguards, the guards themselves, how it works with 5 safes and other standards. Please feel free to ask any of us or all of us questions on the standards themselves or next steps. Yemi, we have a question from Sarah here. Okay, sorry, one in the back first and then Sarah.
Hi, my name is Mike. I come from Manchester. I'm a patient champion and a care ambassador. I like the safeguards because to some extent, they embodies the essence of nothing about me without me, kind of. So, my question is, in terms of those people who want to sign up, how will you inspire or demand to see tangible evidence of EDI and equity in PPI in particular? That's the first question. The second question is, how will you measure the effectiveness of the guards or monitor the uptake of the guard principle themselves?
Brilliant, thank you. So we just heard from Sonia about, there you are, about equity. So perhaps, would you like to take that question about the inclusivity and EDI within public involvement?
Hi there, I was actually looking to see where you are. So for me, and I guess, and being part of research organisations working for them, they talk a lot about equity, and they talk about hard to reach communities. And as someone once said, we're not hard to reach, we're easy to ignore. And it really is that challenging organisations, challenging clinical research, health data research, that they need to reach out to communities, whether it be through community groups, community leaders, to communicate what the research is, and maybe not even what the research question is or to ask the question, what do you think? What do you want? How is this with you? And oftentimes that's not done. We have patient involvement or people, public involved, and they're being told this is what we're doing. But that's not the way to go about it. And I think from all the presentations today, it's really important to fund researchers, fund communities to get involved in research, to explain, to train. And I think until we do that, organisations do that, I think the public are being, certain communities are being excluded from important research. Does that answer your question?
I'll take the second half, if that's okay. So thanks, Mike. So the point of the safeguards in this as well is just to provide that collective sort of emphasis and focus on bringing together examples of best practice and guidance for organisations as to how to overcome these sorts of issues and what the onus is on us. And then to go to your second part of your question, it allows organisations to be audited effectively. So for the transparency piece of work we had last year, the public contributors at HDI UK audited trusted research environments who are sharing the public's data on transparency, and having standards to audit against enabled effective public oversight. And if you look at the work UK Statistics Authority are doing, in their accreditation framework, they're demanding reporting and metrics and evidence that things are being done to an agreed standard. So the safeguards helps surface what that standard looked like, what good looks like in this context, and provides a benchmark which we can start thinking about what does good look like now, how can we reflect on how to do better, and then that continuous improvement process. So it's just the clarity and bringing things together in one framework which helps us on that journey of getting better at doing things over time, including about EDI within public involvement. So thank you very much for your question. I think, where were we next?
Hi, my name is Lee. I run a research charity. My question is whether in your discussions or explorations of these topics, you actually built in the economic side of these things. We see funding appearing in all your slides, honestly. Everything's about funding. Here you have the lever, which is just a step away from funding. And how do you get, just trustworthy kind of data management or access? But we are now still looking at where is the money coming from? There's only a limited amount from the central government. And whilst these might be really well served for first order of how the service, that the public services are actually delivering to us, that's fine. But when you come to the second order, third order, how to create more jobs around this, how to bring more investment in this country around this, how is that dealt with the safeguards review assessment?
Thank you.
Thank you. That's a brilliant question. And we really recognise that traditionally governance as a function hasn't necessarily been well funded as part of research. I think there's a few points. So one is by streamlining and coordinating our efforts, we hope that we can reduce some of the duplication and reduce some of the burden on individual projects. So I think by coming together and by really kind of aligning around the safeguards, and also the work that we're planning to do to build toolkits and resources, the work Rachel's been leading around the contracting templates with the HRA, we hope to make it more straightforward for different TREs looking to make their processes, safeguards compliance. The other piece is working with our funders, and we've had great support from the MRC and particularly the Regulatory Support Centre. We launched this funding call last year specifically around transparency. So we funded 19 TREs to make their data access processes transparent. Coming up this year, we're planning to launch a funding call around contracting, so updating contracting and legal arrangements. So we're also looking for opportunities within HDI UK and the steering group to make more funding available for these areas of governance that are traditionally underfunded.
So perhaps let me reiterate, do the public members in the HDI group understand when they give access to a request, what is the value that we are letting that day-to-day access? Is that to a predatory group that should come back to the NHS and charge us multiple access for using data? You see what I mean? So where is that part of discussion being built?
That's a very complex issue, and it's one where the public, when they're consulted, have a very wide variety of views on who should access data for what purposes, and then when commercial benefit is gained, that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's that value sharing framework, as the NHS are calling that issue at the moment. But how we do that as a system-wide alignment, how it fits into guards it's a complex one, and I don't have the answer to that specific question today. But yes, it's. I think the one thing which your question did stimulate with me was that second and third order benefit. Now, system-wide alignment around governance frameworks, I think, will give confidence to industry that we are working towards an aligned governance principles which are there for the foreseeable future, and that should build sort of economic productivity in terms of consultants being able to support TREs work towards a standard, the development of possibly commercial toolkits and software to support TREs work towards a standard. And if you're thinking about those secondary benefits, alignment should enable the service sector to support these TREs in this deliberation in a similar way to they already do for something like ISO 27001 in information security. So I think alignment and clarity on the principles pushes us in that direction where second and third order benefits are realised and we can involve the commercial sector in productive and meaningful ways. I've lost track of who was next, but I think it was Sarah. Yemi, or have we already given the Fergus, then Sarah, because I said Sarah second, I think. Yemi, just.
Thanks, Andy. Not quite the same question, but sticking on funding. I suppose the question was sort of who are you engaging with around funding the adoption? If I understood correctly, it's the idea is to support the adoption of the safeguards in some form. Who are you sort of engaging with? Because it seems that there is an opportunity, certainly for a number of funders, that they really should align with us right across the board. And actually sort of one pot, if you like, that everyone's contributing to seems like a sensible approach. But I'm curious how you're going about that at the moment.
So I think we are working within a constrained financial climate, and everyone recognises that. And then that is driving an element of consolidation and centralisation of services which are shared. Things like reusable research, where we're building on the value of past work, and then system-wide alignment, because there is no value in reproducing other people's work. So that's the direction we're emphasising at the moment, thinking about what that shared approach could look like and what that common goal could look like. But you're right about, does that drive different views about funding in terms of the research funders? That's a conversation to be had. But what we're trying to do is articulate a common model which people could work towards, and the best practice, and to make the case that this is an efficient way of working which will have benefits, and therefore this is the one which, to take the word cloud word, this is the one model that should be incentivised and supported because it has efficiencies as well as all the wider benefits in terms of trustworthiness and effective balance and sharing a good practice. Anything to add to that? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Sarah Cunningham-Burley, University of Edinburgh and Nuffield Council on Bioethics. So I'm really supportive of the Guard and the safeguards, and also of the way in which they were generated. I think that's really excellent practice. I want to come back to the D of it, the delivery. So we've talked a little bit about how you're actually going to deliver the Guards so that they're used as a framework that will encourage continuous improvement and continuous reflection. I think that's really important. But the deliver part of that, I think, is something that we need to think much more about. So public benefit is used all the time to justify data use, justify almost all of the research that we do as researchers. And I firmly believe that research in and of itself is there's a social benefit to that. We want to generate knowledge. But some of that is much more about the application of the use of the findings from these massive investments in both the data infrastructures and in research for public benefit that should be realised. So both the social value, possible economic value, if that's fairly distributed, and that's a really big if. So it's not only researchers' responsibility to ensure those benefits. So I just wondered how you see that deliver side of it. How can we be accountable, and who's to be held accountable for that? Because on the whole, it's not necessarily the research community. They do have a role to play, of course, but it's actually also our politicians, our policymakers, and others.
Yes. Anyone want to? Rachel? Happy idea. Deliver is one of the more complex of the guards in terms of unpacking what's intended to be covered within that spectrum. So I think deliver includes this notion of responsiveness as well. And I think to answer your question, I'm going to draw on the sort of, again, best practice, what worked in the pandemic. When we were put under pressure as a community, what worked and what innovations did we have? And in the National Core Studies programme, I was part of the Longitudinal Health and Wellbeing National Core Studies, which was designed to make best use of longitudinal research to inform pandemic questions. And what happened there was a much tighter connection between policymakers and organisations such as NICE, who were producing guidance in rapid time, to send the research community the question they wanted answered, and then for us to feed back outcomes in the format which was useful and helpful and on the right time scale for the policymakers to work to. And I agree, we can't put all the emphasis on the researchers getting this right. Much of what you were talking about is out of their control and out of their gift. But what I think would be incredibly interesting is to explore that, so we were calling it, it's jargon, but the policy interface. And it's that cycling of the policymakers being able to ask the researchers the question in the right way and time frame, which can be answered and then fed back into decision making. But also to think about, we've done all this work to make governance more effective in trusted research environments and to open access to sensitive data to legitimate users. How can we get departmental analysts in? How can we get a tighter interdigitation between the people who are doing the analysis in departments and government with the research community and the academic TREs? And I think it's developing the cycles, and the governance angle on this is being able to make that data available with the cadence at which it is needed to inform current policy questions, to enable the access to happen quickly, and then where it starts to interdigitate with public expectations is for the output of that research cycle to be understandable in terms of, yes, some questions are incredibly important and go on to answer policy very quickly, but others just incrementally build knowledge and understanding and are incredibly valuable over the long term to give us assurance that associations remain valid in different populations and so on. So I think what is incumbent on the research community is us to be able to explain to the public that different research outputs have different value, and to be able to adequately reflect that in the transparent materials we're making in like case studies and blogs. And if we have a research register for a TRE saying all these people use this data for this purpose, we're saying what value did it came from that. And it's not to be ashamed of sort of general incremental advances in knowledge versus big impact case studies. It's to make all of it clear that it all builds up into a big picture which improves the public good. I think I sort of picked the bones out of some of your question, but I suppose with all these questions, a lot the safeguards designed to surface these issues and to give us a framework against which we can make challenges like yours, and then to explore what it means and to have the layers of unpacking good practice and what is meant and what we can do to go forward in an improved, coordinated manner. Rachel, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add another layer to that, I suppose, is that increasingly we're seeing public representation on data access committees. I think this needs to really grow. We need to have a diverse representation who can really, so on the research project level, we can really get the emphasis on what the public actually want, what they need, and that this represents different groups. So in that sense, it's taking it away from the traditional committee and the research themselves and bringing that public voice in, and that really needs to, I think, be strengthened, whether it's citizen panels or whichever form it takes. I think that we have an obligation to do that.
Fantastic. We've got time for 2 more questions. So 2 people are holding the microphone right now, and they're the lucky winners. So we're going to start with you, please.
Hi, my name is Yvonne Adebola. I'm part of the executive group at Use My Data, and outside of that, I'm a consultant in health research and communications. And just on the last comment around public engagement, I feel that the elephant in the room in regards to having a diversity of people engaged in public engagement is actually hosting these activities outside of working hours, because there's always going to be a limit to the type of people you are going to attract when it is in the confines of 9:30 to 5:30. And I just wish, because it's just a really obvious barrier to participation for so many people who could bring contrasting views.
Thanks, Yvonne. Sonia or Rachel, do you want to take that?
Hi, Yvonne. I absolutely agree. It's not a 9 to 5. It's continuous. And I guess probably what I talked about earlier would be going out into communities, community leaders, and actually having talks. And it has to be at times that suit the members of the public and not the organisation. Because as you say, if you want true inclusion, you need to hear what the public have to say, and that might mean that it has to be, a weekend or an evening or consultation. I mean, that's really, really important, because if you're just keeping it to a 9 to 5, you're not going to have full representation. And one thing earlier, when I was asked by that gentleman, and I forgot to say, the shared statement to commitment, to public commitment. You've got all these organisations across the spectrum, over 100, coming together now to say, we are signing up to ensure PPI, public commitment. So those are the organisations that are saying that, and they have public contributors. So I, as part of that, I represent HDR UK, but there's a host of organisations that are saying, we have signed up to it, but the proof is in the pudding. They have to show that they're doing it and being held accountable for it. But I completely agree. You need to listen to what the public want. Is that okay?
Hi, okay, so it's me again. I talk as a digital critical friend, they call me, as a public contributor for the Southwest SDE. So one of the SDEs, the three. And I need to say that, first of all, I wanted to ask, you got to the guards, the safeguards, you said through a survey, as the results of a survey, a national survey, yes, UK survey. And did you find any negative aspect of from the public, from the people? We, for example, as in the Southwest SDs, we found that one of the biggest problems is the opt-out. People want to opt out. They want to know how to opt out from their data used in research. And also another big problem is the commercialization, as previous people have been talking about. People want to know if the biggest problem is do we need to charge for the data? And private organizations, do they need to be charged the same as public organizations, researchers, when they use the data?
Yes.
And yes, so these two questions I wanted to share. This the transfer. Really, wow! If the survey was we represented the whole nation, and if there were any negative aspects of the answers from the public.
Thank you for the question. Even though it is the last question, it's ending on a question about negatives. That's still an important question. So Rachel was deep in the analysis. So over to you.
Well, I think the support largely was actually very positive. I'm pleased to say we're the Voices community and ourselves, we're aware of those issues that are big issues that are frequently discussed in this space. The survey went into the purpose of bringing together this framework, and I'm not sure of the statistics right now, but there's a huge support from the public for the need of this, and the fact that the public voice is coming into this in order to address the things that you've raised, the commercial access and how this looks. So the individual components of the principles and commitments is how we address these concerns, essentially. So I'm not going to leave it on a negative note and say that, yes, we've got everybody behind us. So, yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you all for the questions and for listening. And Cathie. Get rid of that. Thank you.
Fantastic, thank you, and thank you particularly for Sonia for sharing your thoughts on that. I don't think our next speaker needs a huge introduction, and we're running slightly behind, so I'll keep it very brief. This meeting wouldn't be complete without hearing from Cathie Sudlow, the author of the recently published Sudlow Review. So I'm delighted to welcome Cathie.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the invitation to be at this meeting. Cathie, I was going to ask you if you'd like me to try and help make up time, but I realise that involves sitting down immediately. So how many minutes do you want at the end, Andrew? Okay, right, great. So we'll stick vaguely to plan then. So I thought I would use this as an opportunity. Ian gave me a brilliant billing at the beginning of the day and said you should all go onto the YouTube channel and watch the launch of the review that was at the start of 8th of November last year, I think. So you should go to that YouTube channel and watch what Chris Whitty, Vinda Wacker, the members of the panel, and very importantly, Ian's very uplifting words at the end were. But you can miss me out because I'm going to sort of run you through a little bit about the review and focus in particular on the importance of good data governance and streamlined proportionate data governance as one of the key recommendations for driving this area forward. So my focus here is on health data, but health relevant data is very pervasive. It falls across all sectors of society, and I would argue, therefore, it forms a really useful paradigm for thinking about how we can use administrative data and data generated by the research community and indeed beyond to think about how to do this sort of thing well and productively for the benefit of patients, the public and society. So this review that I was charged with writing and that took a lot longer than intended was commissioned back in spring 2023, actually. And it was to do two things. It was to map the linkable health data sets, and by that the intention was to cover all data relevant to health across the United Kingdom, and then to outline some of the barriers to sharing or enabling access to those data for public benefit whilst keeping it secure. And then with a focus on England to think about some of the solutions to overcoming those barriers. So this was clearly not the first time this sort of thing had been discussed, so it was important to try and think about the ways in which this review might cover some areas or draw out some themes that maybe hadn't been drawn out particularly before, and to summarise some of the reviews to date. So, and if you want to read it, it's a mere 66 or so thousand words long, and so it won't take you very long, and there's quite a lot of footnotes as well. So, and there's a much shorter executive summary, which I had amazing support in producing from colleagues at Health Data Research UK. And at this stage, I should just say that the support from colleagues in this organisation, Health Data Research UK, for producing this review was from start to finish really absolutely terrific. So Lara Edwards and Lynn Morris, who both work within the organisation, provided amazing support. Esther Balavia did some fantastic work to lead a public consultation specific to the review itself, supported by Doreen Tembo, Cathie and team. Fantastic support from across the senior leadership team, including, of course, Andrew, but many others, Cassie, David Seymour, and Jonathan Wood and Amapreet Judge, who work in communications and external affairs, did a fantastic job of coordinating the launch, which meant that this review, despite its length and the time it took to produce, the timing of its landing was actually pretty useful in terms of informing some government thinking currently and hopefully into the future. And it's been, I think, very well and positively received and very widely seen And that is not to do with me, that's to do with the process that went into ensuring that that happened. So there are many people to thank, and if I've missed anyone out, I apologise, but it was amazing, the support. So there are some key points that came from what was a very long exercise that went on for about 18 months with a considerable amount of consultation, lots of meetings, one-to-ones, group meetings with hundreds and hundreds of stakeholders from across NHS, university, academia, industry, charities, and beyond. And very importantly, some very focused work with patients and members of the public to complement a lot of work that's already gone on to this point and is still ongoing. And then also informed by a lot of thinking from myself and others that has gone on for many years prior to this point and continues even now. So here are some of the key points that I'll come back to that might seem sort of obvious or might be unexpected that I think this review kind of summarises. So the first might be seen as somewhat controversial. The first is not controversial. Health data is used every day to improve people's health and lives. By and large, it's used very safely. Of course, there are issues, but by and large, it works pretty well, and it's certainly used a lot. And then the second might be seen as somewhat controversial, but actually reviewing information from the last 15 years, mostly summarised by a remarkable organisation called Understanding Patient Data, which has done a fantastic job of bringing together this and shedding light on it, actually shows us that, by and large, people very much support the use of their health data to benefit not only themselves, but also others. It's never 100%, but in most surveys and most questionnaires and most exploratory exercises, it is up there. It is a lot higher than the proportion of people who support some much more controversial issues which have been implemented across government and affect our lives day to day. So we should never take this for granted. We have to keep taking the temperature. We have to keep having further and more in-depth and meaningful discussions, and everything that's been said about involvement and engagement is absolutely critical. But we wouldn't have with us today people like Sonia and Michael and others if it wasn't that people are really interested in this. They just want to know what's going on. They want to be involved, and they want to know how it works. And the transparency agenda is obviously absolutely key, and they want to influence and shape it. We have abundant sources of health data from the NHS and critically beyond across the UK. There are fantastic insights that come when these different sources are linked together. I'll illustrate that for you shortly. But there are huge numbers of obstacles and delays to access, link and analyse health data for everybody, even in government, even in departments for whom it is their job to do this day to day. They struggle with this. So we're getting something wrong, and we've heard stories of researchers waiting months or years, it's true, across the board. And a lot of that is because we have complex and inefficient systems. In the NHS, there are zillions, pretty much, but certainly tens or hundreds of different suppliers of health and IT systems in hospitals, in GP practices, in laboratory systems, and so on. And the way in which they talk to each other or not, as the case may be, is very problematic. So that's kind of problem number one area of complexity. There are many other areas of complexity, which include those we've been talking about today, around access, governance, and proportionate and streamlined, sensibly streamlined systems so that people can navigate their way through. I've been occupying and playing a role in this landscape for probably 15 years, and I found it really, really difficult to find a way of describing and explaining it from the perspective of health data alone. So, God help people who are members of the public with an interest who want to know about and understand this, because it is really, really difficult to navigate, and it's on all of us to make it easier, because how can we have transparency when we have this degree of complexity? So these barriers prevent and delay crucial analysis and research, not just about COVID, but about other pandemic health conditions and many others: cardiovascular disease, cancer, arthritis, diabetes, the big killers and maimers of our time, and many, many rare conditions affecting people across the life course, millions of people across the UK. So by not doing this better, we're letting everybody down. And our health data, our health relevant data, amongst other data assets, should be seen as critical national infrastructure. So those are the key points. I will whiz through the rest. But here is health relevant data across the UK on a single, slightly cat-candidly constructed slide, which I've used far too many times. But of course, we have data arising in the NHS and increasingly data that's surfaced and collected and brought together through multiple organisations at entire country or national level across the 4 nations of the UK is increasingly now surfaced and shared through secure data environments. Wind back a few years, that was the case in Wales and in Scotland and through the ONS Secure Research Service for a wide range of, but not a complete range of administrative data sets. And we're in a much better position now with respect to healthcare, pushed on by the needs of the pandemic, but arguably it should have been there already and it would have made life a lot easier during the pandemic had it been. But we're at risk of slipping backwards if we see this as only there for the purposes of subserving the needs of a crisis that hit this country a few years ago. We need it to be there for a very broad range of purposes. And there are many, many other health conditions that can benefit from this sort of infrastructure and that should indeed benefit from it for the benefit of society, other than pandemics, which of course are an extremely good use case and a great driver. But beyond these nationally collated data sets, we also have data held locally and regionally, which tends to be more complex, less well structured. You can't stick it on a spreadsheet. It's images, it's free text, and beyond. And so we have a need to be able to surface and use these types of data as well, because they add granularity and detail for some purposes. And then health relevant data is also collected day to day in non-NHS settings as well. Data relevant to our health are collected through education systems, in the census, in disability systems, income and so on. These are all relevant to and determinants of and consequences of health and should be considered as relevant to our health. And then outside of these administrative settings are many other sources of data: personal monitoring, smartphones, watches, club cards, all of that sort of thing. Environmental data collected through weather systems and pollution monitoring, and critically, data generated by the research community, large-scale observational survey studies, cohorts, whatever you want to call them, some very big, some smaller, some bespoke to particular conditions, some very much more general, and large-scale clinical trials. All of these different sources of data are in and of themselves really great, brilliant, very informative, particularly if they're used and analysed well, and particularly if they're inclusive and recognise the need for diversity. But they are transformationally brilliant if they can be linked together. So UK Biobank, to give you one example, can only conduct its follow-up of all 500,000 participants through linkage to routinely collected administrative data from the health system and elsewhere. And the same is true of all other large-scale and smaller-scale cohorts. They can all be enhanced through this sort of linkage. And it happens, but we don't have systems for it to happen seamlessly and repeatedly, and that's but one example. The same is true of clinical trials. So a few examples of where this does work and has worked well. It started to become possible during the course of the pandemic to do observational studies at whole population scale with increasing ease. I would argue that we're at risk of that slipping backwards, but here's one example, probably the first published research study, including all people pretty much in all 4 nations of the UK, led by Aziz Sheikh from the University of Edinburgh and supported by Health Data Research UK, with huge input from a massive team of others, and demonstrating rates of vaccination and, importantly, under-vaccination against COVID-19, a great driver, and looking at what types of people were most likely to be under-vaccinated against JCVI criteria, and what the risks of getting severe COVID were if one was not vaccinated, what types of people that applied to, and what might have happened had vaccination been as recommended. So in a way, the interest of this study is less in the particular question it addressed and the particular answers that were generated, although that of course is what captured the interest of journalists and in many respects the wider public, but that it was now possible, and it is now possible, to link together different sources of health data from primary care, secondary care, mortality registers, COVID vaccination and COVID testing in this case, to generate these sorts of results that are inclusive of and so naturally representative of and generalizable to the entire population. And beyond linking these different healthcare sources, of course, as I've alluded to, it's important to be able to link data not just from that's generated through the health system, but health-relevant data that's generated elsewhere. And increasingly, it's possible to do this as well within secure data environments, which you've heard a great deal about, and with appropriate streamlined governance. And these systems are starting to be developed. And I really have to recommend the work of the Pan-UK Data Governance Steering Group in starting to do the delivery work on this. It's very easy to write sort of policy recommendations about this must happen, this next thing must happen. It's actually moving from policy to delivery where the real difficulty is. And it is hard. And it needs people to pull together and to take off their organisational or institutional hats. And this is not just about universities, it's about across the whole sector, and to appreciate the input of multiple different disciplines and patients and the public. And one example of this is through this kind of mission to link data across different sectors. This example is around linking data from healthcare to data from the education sector at whole population scale, initially in Wales, which has been a trailblazer for some of this type of work, but also now in England. And there's this great resource called eChild, which has linked data from education to health, which is now available for generating insights about the impact of education on health outcomes and health in early life on later educational outcomes in England, which is a large population, so it's great. Except it took years to pull it together, and it does not include any data from general practice. So the vast majority of health outcomes that are relevant to children are not included in this resource because of issues to do with the way in which we link these different sources together. So it's a fantastic step forward, but there's a caveat, and there's a need to make this sort of thing much more business as usual. And then finally, linking data to enhance large-scale clinical trials. We have some great examples. The recovery trial, most people have heard about because it was so prominent during the pandemic. It's not only very large, it recruited 40,000 participants during the pandemic and has continued to recruit with an extension to different types of pneumonia now. But it uses the centralised systems provided through NHS England and equivalent organisations in the devolved nations to follow participants up through their hospital data and their death data to ascertain outcomes. Again, there's a gap and a great possibility to do more with linkages to primary care or GP data to find out about all the outcomes that are not going to be surfaced through admissions to hospital, which is actually going to be many for longer term follow-up. And then we have the NHS Gallery trial testing a new blood test for detecting cancer. And these types of screening programs are only going to be evidence-based if they can be tested in very large numbers of people. So NHS DigiTrials was able to support invitations being sent out centrally on a national scale across England to invite millions of people and enable the recruitment of 140,000 to a trial of appropriate size to test this question. And then here's another example from linking observational data to routine administrative data, again, in this case, health data from UK Biobank, which illustrates one of several thousand studies that have used the UK Biobank resource. In this case, showing through linking data from accelerometry devices worn by 100,000 or so participants, objectively measuring their physical activity, linking that through to later life health outcomes, ascertained through that linkage between the research resource and the routine data from the health service. So these are some great examples. It shows what's possible. It shows that these many sources of data can be used to inform, to save and improve people's lives. This is a tiny smattering. There's loads of government analyses by the UK Health Security Agency, analyses by NICE, analyses by the MHRA that are doing or that need this kind of capability as well. So there are a multitude of research users if you have a broad view of what a research use might be. But they're far too often the exceptions. This is not business as usual, and there's still great complexity, friction, and gaps. So this review generated some priorities from very broad consultation, broadly divided into two categories: priorities for data, and this is very health-focused, of course, and priorities for the system. And you can see the data priorities. By far, the top of the vast majority of stakeholders' list was general practice data, where we have many systems for providing access to general practice data, but none of them alone, and even collectively, all of them do not provide for the needs of the research community and the community of analysts in government and beyond. So that needs fixing. And then there are many others, because there is huge complexity and these data are generated from a wide range of sources. But just to illustrate one screening, this is something I learned. I knew quite a lot before I started this review, but I learned a huge amount. And one thing I learned was that, and this is being fixed now, I hope Michael Chapman might be able to tell us it has been fixed, but we have fantastic cancer registries in this country. We have fantastic cancer registries in all 4 nations of the UK, and we have screening programs in all 4 nations of the UK that are largely similar, including cancer screening programs. And it is far from systematic and rarely done, and when it has been done, it has taken years, to link data on who is being screened to who is getting cancer. Just doesn't happen. That is, in my view, indefensible. And I imagine that most members of the public would be pretty appalled to know that that is not routinely happening. So we can't monitor how our screening programs work. This is but one example of stuff that just doesn't happen because of the complexity of the systems. So there are a number of system priorities as well, and some of them I've spoken about already. National data assets are critical. Access beyond COVID, where we made progress, is critical. Linkage of different sources of data together is what is transformational. But importantly, and pertinent to this discussion today, is the need to streamline and standardize governance, access, and data systems. And we've talked a lot today about some of the work that is going on that is pan-UK, so not just England-focused, to try and generate some of the intelligence and requirements and systems and help that people require to be able to do that well, and it's to be commended. Reducing complexity is really important, and I think that's part of this journey. So there's complexity at many points in the system. We haven't spoken about complexity in the sort of legal and regulatory systems and the interpretation thereof, but there's a huge amount of work going on to try and shed light on that as well, also led by Cathie and her team here, but very much working in partnership with a huge number of other organisations across the UK, trying to draw different thinking and perspectives together. Building and maintaining patient, public and professional trust has been spoken about a lot today. And we've spoken a lot about the public, but actually health professionals are really important as well in this space, and perhaps none more important than general practitioners, who work somewhat differently from those of us who work in hospitals. They're not employees of the health service, they're effectively independent contractors. The relationships are tricky, and they need to be understood and respected before we can really make progress there, as well as fixing some of the legislative and data decision-making processes. And there are a number of others that you can see here. So this, I won't go back over my key points, but I just want to show them again and then draw you to the recommendations that were made through the review. The first is about organisational structures, where there are many, many organisations with an interest in this that are sitting at national level, that often work somewhat orthogonally to each other. It's always a delight to see when they work in alignment. And we saw that happen from time to time during the pandemic in a way that's not happened before, and I still see it happen from time to time. I'm seeing it happen a bit now in terms of some of the government advisory work that's going on towards the NHS 10-year health plan and life sciences strategy, and when it does happen and people really pull together and try to understand different perspectives, it makes a massive difference. Health data should be seen as critical national infrastructure. Perhaps the recommendation that's had the most traction and is being adopted with slightly different interpretations, but adopted very seriously across the Department of Health, NHS England, Office for Life Sciences and other major bodies, is this notion of establishing a national health data service with a single national health data access system. And that requires streamlined and standardized data governance and access. There's a huge amount that this forum can do to inform that and to help with the delivery end beyond the policy. Highlighting the need for a national system for general practice data is a big part of this as well. And then transforming access to and linkage of data from across sectors is a major need. And there's a risk that that might get lost if we focus too much on health data as data that arises from the NHS. It has to be seen as a cross-sectoral mission. Clearly coordinated and ongoing meaningful engagement and involvement of patients, public and health professionals, among others, beginning with P also, very, very important. And then there are a couple of recommendations that are less English specific and more UK-wide, and they are around the things we've been talking about today, data access processes, proportionate data governance, and systems for standards and accreditation of secure data environments, where we need true UK-wide systems. This concept of data access, data sharing, and data transfer, we shouldn't really need to have to use these words so carefully. If the idea was that data is generated within secure environments, moves where it has to between secure environments, and is accessed within secure environments. So these words that sometimes a bit of a kind of way of working around these issues, but actually if it was secure from start to finish, there are a number of different models that might work, and sometimes we sweat it out over whether it's federation or transfer or whatever. As long as it's safe and secure, we should use whatever is available to us now whilst working on better, more cost-effective and efficient and increasingly safe models for the future. I thought it would be interesting just to show very briefly this summary generated by the Office for Life Sciences, entirely independent of me. I found it quite helpful because it shows that largely the external views of what's been written have been, in my view anyway, not too far off what I intended to be saying, so this is good. And it's also important because this is kind of being used to help support some decision-making that's currently going on in government, particularly in England, but actually with some UK-wide resonance as well. So we have many rich sources of data. We can't make the most of them. There's huge untapped potential across the potential to use this to support care for individuals, to inform an intelligent healthcare system, to support the planning and delivery of equitable healthcare for everybody, and to support a thriving research and innovation landscape. The same data, whether it applies to individuals or collectively to large groups of individuals or entire populations, can and should be helping to do all of that in a seamless way, with research and delivery of healthcare seen as joined at the hip. And only with an ambitious and joined-up data strategy can that happen. And they, as you can see, that the recommendations that have been made have been largely reiterated here, with the last one fusing the two final recommendations that are in the review, but essentially endorsing the notion of establishing UK-wide processes and standards. So I thought I would just finish by saying that I think there is, if one wants to look at this in a glass half full rather than half empty way, there is some hope and opportunity on our doorstep happening at the moment. So the UK government is developing an ambitious sector plan for life sciences as part of its industrial strategy, and in parallel developing its 10-year health plan to overhaul the NHS, where life sciences will be critical. There's been a major attempt for large national organisations to pull together on doing this in concert. It sometimes feels a bit chaotic. There's an awful lot of people involved, but I think the intention to try and see research and healthcare and life sciences as part of the same system is a very valuable intention. And the current plan is that the 10-year health plan and sector plan for life sciences will come out around about May, June 25. Obviously, this is subject to many other moving parts, way above my pay grade, but that's what it looks like at the moment. And there is involvement of several of us in this room in these processes in an advisory capacity, and this feels like it's an opportunity to start shifting the dial. It's one amongst several opportunities, moving, as I was saying, from advice to policy to delivery, and start to look at some of the delivery possibilities. And it requires, I'm interested to learn, and it's kind of obvious really, seeing things very much through the lens of the UK government's agenda. So it's all about economic growth, a healthy and therefore wealthy population, which is active and is working, is clearly a contribution to economic growth. That requires a great health and care system. And it also involves thinking about the major shifts in health that the government has proposed, so hospital to community, analogue to digital, treatment to prevention. These are the important levers to sort of try and hang some of our endeavours on. So I'm going to stop there and hand over to Andrew, and sorry that I've gone on a bit too long. Yeah, no, I'm very happy.
A bit late, but we'll just have
I didn't want to
few
run you
questions
over, but
before
yeah,
we
sure.
hand over to Andrew.
Delighted to.
Any questions for Cathie? Beth?
Hi, Kirsten Dutton from ESRC. I know there's not a huge amount of information out there and lots of different timelines happening at the moment, but do you have any kind of initial thoughts on how the recommendation around the National Health Data Service aligns with the kind of how it might work with the National Data Library?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant question. So the National Data Library is, as I understand it, is a kind of broad concept which goes across sectors. And I think as we heard earlier, there's been some discussions about where does health fit. And this is partly because health is in many respects, health data and uses of health data are in many respects the poster child for many of the things that government are talking about. AI, a lot of the illustrations come from, for example, AI tools that are used in radiology settings or pathology settings or other healthcare settings that are being implemented, although there are many other opportunities, of course. But some of the regulation and legal kind of frameworks are a little bit different for health than they are for elsewhere. So there's a need to start, I think, joining those dots so that health can be seen as very much part of the National Data Library concept, which, and I'm sure everyone in this room would recognise that. But there's a risk that because health is kind of also from a governance perspective sometimes in the too difficult box, that it gets left out, and that has happened in the past, and it feels like this is an opportunity to make sure it's in the tent. My other comment on the National Data Library from talking to Ian earlier on is that clearly the concept is not really a new one. Actually, what the Office for National Statistics has been doing for a long time is trying to draw together the capabilities to link data across government. We've seen fantastic commentaries from both the UK Statistics Authority and the Office for Statistics Regulation supporting this direction of travel, and we've seen good examples of it actually working in practice, almost as a matter of routine in some of the smaller nations, notably Wales, particularly for the research community, if not for so seamlessly for the broader community. So the National Data Library feels to me a bit like the government label for the Integrated Data Service, which the ONS is developing. But so joining those two together, Ian might want to comment more, but that feels like it's a natural direction of travel. And of course, health needs to be included. So the NHS and the ONS talking to each other on a regular basis with a real commitment to make this happen in a sort of bi-directional way, and to allow researchers to flourish around, and researchers in a very broad sense of the world, from the NHS, from academia, from industry, would be my kind of dream for the future.
Sorry. Thanks, Cathie, for a very insightful presentation. You mentioned that you had priorities for data-specific and then system-specific priorities. I just want to know, out of interest, have you identified any pulsating people-specific priorities.
So you mean from members of the public? Yeah. So there was a process specifically around this review where there were some workshops done in the autumn of 2023. 2 workshops that were coordinated by colleagues at Health Data Research UK, facilitated by the public patient advisory processes and outreach processes within HDR UK. And the Voices Network were very important to that, but the networks went beyond that. So there were 2 workshops which really helped to inform that. Priorities of patients and members of the public aligned very neatly, actually, with the they're one of the major stakeholder groups, and obviously it's a pretty diverse group. But I think the thinking here is also informed by many other public and patient and broader consultation exercises summarised by Understanding Patient Data, amongst others, who have highlighted very similar kind of issues, concerns and priorities around data. And other stakeholders who tended to put GP data near the top of the list were, from all those other sectors that I mentioned earlier.
Hi, I'm Amy Tilbrook from Datalock and the Usher Institute at Edinburgh. I wondered if you could expand a little bit more on the single unified health data access system. Are you thinking of a national infrastructure, a national decision-making panel? What does the system mean?
So I think both of those. And by national, my ambition maybe is not ambitious enough in the sense that I've almost accepted that we have 4 nations in the UK who all do things somewhat differently, and that having a single system and process for all 4 nations in one step is probably an ask too far. But if we could get that to work in England, and my recommendations in this regard were England specific, but they could apply equally to the devolved nations of the UK, who, in some respects are more advanced in some areas and less in others, and there are kind of interesting differences one could go into. But it needs to be both about the necessary technical infrastructure, the necessary legal and regulatory infrastructure, the necessary consultation and engagement infrastructure, and the necessary decision-making infrastructure. But what I observe in sort of lots of different walks of life in this area is that the more decision makers you have along a chain, you only need one to kind of upset the apple cart, and you just can't get anywhere. So I think some of the issues that people have had with access is that everyone interprets things differently. You get a kind of race to the bottom in terms of, it's easier to say no when things are complicated and difficult and there are risks to the organisation and liability is not being dealt with well and not being absorbed where it needs to be by government. So I think it's sort of trying to aim for a single system. Now, that doesn't necessarily always mean one decision maker, but it means one process to coordinate and streamline decision making, so that it can be easier to navigate. Some of my thinking on this has been informed by working with UK Biobank for many years, which is obviously a relatively small organisation in this larger kind of a whole ecosystem. But there was a great emphasis on making it work, streamlining it, trying not to dwell on every single project, but use kind of a case law approach to set up processes that made decision-making faster and faster, and to measure decision-making time from the get-go. So I think, performance metrics are also going to be really important here.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Cathie. Brilliant to end on that note of opportunity as well. And thank you for the fantastic questions.
Terrific. So I'm Andrew Morris. I'm Director of Health Data Research UK. And 2 minutes, hold me to account. So first of all, a huge thank you to you for coming, to ONS, our partners, ADR UK, the Office for Statistical Regulation, and most importantly, our 11 public contributors and partners, many of whom have spoken today, which has been terrific. So a huge thanks. And I think we've had a great day, and I would argue, to echo Ian, it was prescient, fantastic timing. We are living through an exciting moment in time. Who would have envisaged the Prime Minister talking about data and AI? He spoke about health data for half an hour. It was amazing. We're going to send him an honorary master's degree because we thought he was pretty good. So we are. But this country needs support and help from data to wrestle the knotty societal issues which we're all facing to the ground. And to do that, as Ian said, we need collaboration, but we also need delivery. And I like the quote, don't mistake activity for achievement. And we've got to think about impact and outputs. Can we thank Robert? Because I thought his talk was great, and we are actually going to try and get it published as a sort of piece. But he talked about the societal need to harness intangible assets, because intangible assets, of which data is one, have huge value. But how do we wrap them up in a trustworthy way? And we love the OSR 6 principles of leadership, collaboration, transparency, practical solutions, safe use of data, and data literacy. It gives us a great framework. And I would argue that led very well into the, we have a quademic, don't we? We had a quadruple act of Cathie, Andy, Sonia, and Rachel, which I thought was terrific. Because what Safeguards is trying to do is to provide the tools, the policies, perhaps the automation that allows us to automate this trustworthy use of data at scale. And I think actually making life easier for data custodians is going to be really important. So what are those practical things we can do? Because if this is just seen to be bureaucracy, we will not. So how can we ensure that the Safeguards framework is enabling? So I thought that was terrific. And I sensed there was a fair wind behind Safeguards. But how do we build upon that and make people's lives easier? And then we had Cathie, who's a national, wait, she's still here? She's a national treasure. Oh, there she is. Because I think this is very ground, sort of bottom-up collaboration. But what Cathie's superb work has done is to give us a sort of fair policy wind behind us, which I think, going back to Ian, we're at an exciting moment in time. And we have a duty, because most of us in this room are supported by the public purse. And, we have a duty to work in partnership to sort this. And we often say, we need more money. But I would challenge us to say, right, what can we do with the 95% of resources that we have that are sitting in our organizations, rather than squabbling about the 5% we don't have? Because with good alignment, we can do great things. So that would be my challenge. So I'll finish there, but with one or two quotes. This is a sort of bottom-up initiative, so it's not about announcing goals loudly, it's about delivering quietly and letting your results speak volume. So let's maybe approach it like that. To quote the FT this week, because I would argue that if we get this right, with humility, we can navigate a path which has global relevance. And the FT says Britain does not need to walk an EU or US path on artificial intelligence. But I would argue that also applies to the trustworthy use of data. Because as we heard earlier from Rachel, a lot of folk around the world are wrestling with those knotty issues around trustworthy use of data. So can the UK demonstrate a model that's trustworthy? But I'll finish with a Sonia quote, because I thought it was great. And I won't do the Northern Irish accent. Oh, go on, try. The eyes of the... I know that's Scottish, isn't it? The eyes of the public are on you. which I thought was a great quote. So can we thank you, Sonia? These things don't just happen. Can I thank Cathie, Andy, the whole team, Esther, Mita, who's here, for putting on this event. We will write up a sort of consensus statement or some sort of summary with next steps. But let's collaborate, let's deliver, and let's do stuff that's trustworthy and beneficial to society. Thank you very much.